Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on the SKYLIT Books Podcast. I'm Tyler Austin, your host and bookseller here at SKYLIT. Today I'm going to be joined by Kliph Nesteroff, who is a several times published author with great books, including The Comedians, We Had a Bit of a Real Estate Problem, one of the most controversial blogs amongst old comedians that ever existed, as he's been called the king of comedy lore. And I just want to say, thanks so much for joining us, Kliph, and we appreciate having you here today.
My pleasure.
And we're talking about your new book, Outrageous.
Yeah.
Which is about, I guess generally political correctness, the culture wars, and how it intersects with showbiz over the course of basically the entire history of showbiz?
Well, essentially the premise is that for the past several years, we have all been told over and over and over that you can't say anything anymore, you can't joke about anything anymore, comedy's under fire, end of free speech. And my argument, based on thousands of examples and evidence-based research throughout history, is exactly the opposite, that there's more free speech today than at any other point in the history of American comedy. So that's the crux of the book, and if you're skeptical of that argument, the book is chock full of examples demonstrating that to be true.
Yeah, so I guess my first thought was, obviously this book feels incredibly timely. But you kind of read the book and you go, I guess you could have written this book at any time in the past 150 years. And, people saying that they can't say anything anymore would have been applicable. Mm-hmm. But so as that has heated up over the last 3, 4, 5 years, as the internet has kind of gotten into a fever pitch over it, was there a particular moment that made you go, I need to look into this and see, is this actually true? Or was it just sort of a general buildup of...
Well, I always knew it wasn't true.
Okay.
It's so obvious to me that isn't true when you consider what is permissible on modern cable television, streaming services, satellite radio, the stage, podcasts, the internet, compared to as recently as 2004... Let's go back. Do you remember Janet Jackson's nipple and the hysteria around a half-second glimpse of half a nipple? Most people watching that Super Bowl halftime show with Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson, when her nipple was very briefly exposed, I don't think anybody actually saw her nipple. Like, it was so fast, you would not have really noticed or realized, but it became an evangelical hysteria. For an entire year, it was debated. It was the focus of think pieces and a campaign against immoral Hollywood. It upended Janet Jackson's career and ultimately led to a $500,000 fine imposed by the FCC, a fine the FCC would not have imposed if not for this evangelical lobby fever pitch saying this is the downfall of America, this is so obscene. Okay, 2004, not that long ago, half a nipple. Today, we can look at the most vile pornography through our internet provider at home, no controversy. You can watch a show like The Righteous Gemstones or Euphoria on HBO. The opening scene of episodes in both of those programs, different episodes, you can see people's dicks waving through the air, not controversial, no debate, no campaign. Pete Davidson has a sitcom on NBC Peacock. I watched the first episode not that long ago. I was disgusted by it. The opening scene is Pete Davidson jerking off, and he comes on his mother. That's the opening scene. Okay, compare this to 20 years ago, Janet Jackson's half a second of a nipple and the hysteria. The comparison between what you could and could not do then to now, it's remarkable. That's just 2004. Right. Now, if we go back to the first half of the 20th century and look at what the taboos were in comedy, you couldn't joke about politics, not with any pointed commentary about specific policies. You couldn't ridicule religion without it becoming a huge hysteria or completely censored. You couldn't swear on stage without threat of being arrested, and certainly you couldn't do expressions of sexuality like Nikki Glaser does today. Lenny Bruce is a famous example of the persecuted comedian, the arrested comedian, and he was arrested for a number of different reasons at different times, sometimes drug use, which had nothing to do with his act, sometimes criticism of religion, sometimes cussing. In 1962, Lenny Bruce was arrested in liberal Hollywood in the parking lot of the Crescendo nightclub, not far from where the Comedy Store is today, by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. He was arrested, handcuffed, booked, fingerprinted, mug-shotted for saying the word schmuck on stage, 1962. So the idea that you can't joke about anything anymore, you can't say anything anymore, there's no more free speech, is a ridiculous argument compared to what you could and could not say through most of the 20th century. And even to this day, the restrictions on something like Jimmy Fallon's Tonight Show, you still can't say fuck. Nikki Glaser still couldn't do her actual nightclub act on that show. The difference between cable today and streaming today compared to the rules and regulations of ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox could not be more drastic. And frankly, it's archaic, those restrictions. Nobody cares if you swear anymore. So anyways, I have thousands of examples in the new book and thousands more that were cut out to avoid making it completely redundant.
Sure.
But you can say so much more in comedy and in society, period, today than you could as recently as 2004 in the Janet Jackson nipple era.
Yeah. It's there were several things in there that, I mean, the arrests that you talk about, I mean, Lenny Bruce is the famous example, everyone, as sort of a bastion of free speech. But it was incredible to me in the book, I mean, having not really heard how much longer that continued. Again, someone like Cheech and Chong were arrested in Tampa in 1975 and were booked. And, so those arrests continued and more guys were, and women, Joan Rivers, was threatened with a bomb as late as the set, So it was just kind of incredible to see that continued on for another decade.
Well, one of the other reasons I knew that this argument was bullshit is I used to do stand-up, and it was before Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, before the word podcast existed. And I was punched 3 different times, and I had a pitcher of beer poured over my head in Vancouver, and in a completely different incident, I had a pitcher of beer poured over my head in Toronto. And it had to do with, 1, you're dealing with unruly drunks. 2, I was an insult comedian, so it can be taken the wrong way. But when somebody rushed the stage, when Dave Chappelle was performing at the Hollywood Bowl, I saw Howie Mandel forecast that it was the end of comedy. Like, this seems like a rather drastic thing. And the propaganda that we've seen in the past few years, if you can't joke about anything anymore, has mostly come from people outside of comedy, mostly from political players and editorial commentators. But it has really affected the perceptions of comedians themselves. So somebody like Bill Maher, who should know better, somebody like Howie Mandel, who should know better, I'm sure they have instances throughout their career, especially their early career as touring comedians, in which they dealt with an unruly audience or somebody sabotaging the show or somebody trying to prevent them from doing something. Certainly they both have signed contracts over the course of their careers to do what we call a corporate gig in stand-up, which is a private gig where you're paid a ton of money to do a certain amount of time, but you sign a contract that will say things like, don't make fun of the boss, don't mention the company, don't swear, don't do graphic sexuality, don't get into politics, don't get into religion. And comedians have always signed those contracts because you get 10 grand for doing 20 minutes of work. So those types of restrictions have always occurred in certain situations, and it still occurs. And you do a college campus, same thing. You have to sign this contract that you will or will not do a certain amount of thing. Even on a very innocuous level, you have to adhere to a specific amount of time. You have to do 20 minutes, not 25 minutes, not 15 minutes in order to ensure your payment. If you want to appear on late night television, you work with a segment producer who says, no, take that out. Let's go with this, but change that word. And comedians say, sure. They don't scream freedom of speech, cancel culture. It's just part of the game. But this propaganda that we've been exposed to the past several years has affected people like Howie Mandel now to the effect that they'll say things like, this is the end of comedy, which is really, it's almost behind the scenes. A lot of this idea that free speech is being suppressed comes from right-wing think tanks. It comes from evangelical forces. And then this idea that the end is nigh is like a evangelical cliche. And now it has affected people who are not part of that sphere just because it's repeated over and over so frequently. So you can have somebody like Howie Mandel saying something like, this is the end of comedy, which is really something that you would expect somebody like Pat Robertson to say. Not about comedy, but like, this is the end times, the end is near, the rapture is coming. And it never occurs. Comedy has not died. It has continued to flourish. And most of the people who supposedly have been silenced have not been silenced. And that's not to say that censorship doesn't still exist. It does. Like I said, the Jimmy Fallon Tonight Show example, you have to censor your own act and work with a segment producer, and willingly so, in order to do the Tonight Show. And that has always been the case. And I'm not even saying that is right. I'm just saying that is something that has been there all
that
along.
Have always existed in the history of comedy.
Yeah, I don't think those perimeters should exist. It seems archaic to me that ABC, CBS, NBC would still not permit you to say fuck or shit or whatever when you can hear it in every single other medium. It makes no sense. Mainstream programming. That Pete Davidson sitcom example I gave, completely revolting to me. But it's on the NBC streaming service, Comcast. Was that the network that broadcast the Janet Jackson Nipplegate? I can't recall. I don't know if it was ABC or NBC, but it just seems so old-fashioned to retain those restrictions, but they do.
And I think comics in general are willing to take on a sort of victimhood if they can wrap their arms around it.
Well, the irony is that a lot of comedians these days like to lay claim to being a truth teller.
Yeah, philosopher kings.
Well, you're not a very good truth teller or philosopher if you're getting duped by lies.
Yeah. Yeah.
You should be able to expose the lies for what they are. And so it's sad to me to see otherwise intelligent people easily manipulated. But the internet and social media is such an effective manipulator. If something is repeated over and over and over and over all day, and the repeaters have the resources to keep doing that financially, eventually it does have an effect, and people start to believe nonsense. And certainly the general public believes it. You know, when comedians are interviewed on morning radio, there's always the same list of cliches that they ask, like, were you always a funny kid? Were you the class clown? Where do you get your ideas from? And now there's a new one added to the list. It was like, boy, this cancel culture, you can't say anything anymore, huh? And it's because those questioners are affected by the repetition of that talking point.
Yeah.
But that talking point for the past several years has been picked up by political commentators who have no relation to comedy whatsoever. And so part of the purpose of writing this book is to counteract that. I find it disturbing when I hate to use the word narrative, it's such a cliche these days, but the narrative of you can't say anything anymore or you can't joke about anything anymore has largely been controlled and driven by people outside of comedy.
Yeah.
And now it has affected the thinking of people within comedy. And I would like to correct that.
Well, and that's something I think you kind of paint that picture in the way that it changed it, because people saying you can't say anything anymore, as you document, goes literally back to the very origins of show business, when people first started being like, maybe blackface is bad. And people were going, but then how am I supposed to make a living? I can't tell jokes anymore. And then that continues on, and it happened with Irish jokes, and it happened with Italian jokes, it happened with Jewish jokes.
Yes.
And you just kind of keep showing that cycle over and over again, which is totally appropriate that these people would say, you know, these are wrong, hurtful stereotypes that shouldn't be perpetuated. And of course, comics go, well, what are we supposed to do? How am I supposed to get laughs?
Yeah.
And then that has been now weaponized, that idea of, you know, I can't get laughs. These people can't get laughs. They can't say anything anymore, and it's become, like you say, this sort of firebrand political point taken up by outside forces.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes some of it is contrived. You know, there are comedians who are intentional provocateurs. On an apolitical standpoint, there was Andy Kaufman, and for him, it wasn't necessarily about getting a laugh. It was like getting a reaction, right? And you still see that today, but now it's a little bit more political. So people will bait the audience either with using a slur or saying something that is sort of taboo, but without the joke, without the comedy. They'll just say the taboo, and the audience will go, oh, and then the provocateur on stage will go, what? You're too sensitive? And it's like, but you wanted that reaction. It's designed to get that reaction. And there's nothing worse than bombing in silence. So if you can't get big laughs, sometimes any reaction will do. And sometimes it's fun to get a reaction from an audience among the laughter that is something different. But there are a school of comics who provoke for the sake of provocateur for the sake of provocateur, and then act indignant when they succeed at that. And that's sort of weird. But ultimately, the people with the most natural ability don't have much difficulty navigating being funny, because it's instinctual. It's really not about coming up with, what could I say that you're not supposed to say, or what could I even, social commentary, what could I say that's going to be philosophical or profound. A comedian doesn't think like that. They think in terms of, I think this is funny. Let's try it on stage. If it gets a laugh, we'll keep it. And if it doesn't work, we'll try and adjust it. If it still doesn't work, we'll throw it out. Most comedy is derived by a funny person through instinct. And I think sometimes people who aren't funny just can't grasp that. That's why they're so fascinated with it. Like, where do you get your material from? Where do you get your ideas? And it's like, you don't intentionally find your ideas. It's when you're a gifted, naturally, organically funny person, you just see the world that way. You learn pretty early on that when you open your mouth and you're in a room with a crowd of people, for some reason they laugh more often than not. And other people just that don't have that knack, and they can never make that room laugh, even no matter how hard they try. So most people who have that natural gift, it's an instinct. It's not a contrived construct. But sometimes the provocateur comedian does not have that natural gift. So any reaction will do.
Boy, I mean, is there anything at this point watching stand-up comedy that makes me want to tune out less than the person starting their joke by saying, oh, you just can't say anything anymore, but I'm going to go there.
Well, I think it was 2015, maybe, when Dave Chappelle did his first Netflix special, they released a trailer. I got to find it, because I haven't looked at it since it came out. But I remember thinking this, and this was before all the Chappelle controversies and whatnot. It was supposed to be like his comeback special, because he was kind of like in unicorn mode, where there was rumors, Dave Chappelle was here last night, but he wasn't everywhere yet. Again, he had been, and then he disappeared, and then this was sort of his comeback. And Netflix released a trailer, and it was Dave Chappelle with a microphone, like trekking through Death Valley or something. He was in the desolate desert. And the trailer said he's going to say the things you're not supposed to say. Now, this was before all that transgendered controversy that followed him around. And so it was marketed that way.
Right.
Ahead of time, before anybody had saw it, before anybody had determined he was saying something you can't say, it was marketed that way. And so part of it is a real contrivance. I'm going to say what you can't say. Well, doesn't that contradict itself? If you can't say it, how is it that you're saying it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're on a stage with a microphone being amplified over a crowd of people.
It's sort of
put onto Netflix.
It's sort of an insult to the comedians that did suffer in the past. Yes. Lots of comedians were arrested. Mae West spent 10 days in a prison workhouse for doing a show called Sex on Broadway, a comedy that she wrote. Lenny Bruce, of course. George Carlin was arrested in 1972. Richard Pryor was arrested in 1974. Many, many marginal comedians you've never heard of were arrested. There was a guy named Hoppy Hopkins who mostly did lounges in Hawaii. He was arrested doing a show in Anaheim, I think in 65 or 66. It was a citizen's arrest. Somebody came out of the audience and pinned him down and held him until the police arrived, and then they did arrest him because he said fuck on stage. And I think that was in 66. So it's an insult to those comedians who had to go through it to claim that you're going through that today when you're not,
When essentially it's the same thing that's been happening again, like you've said and pointed out in the book repeatedly.
People will often get mad at comedians. I'm not saying that there aren't people who often are irrational in their grievance. Also, I would never lump every grievance together. You got to see what people are saying on a case-by-case basis. Maybe somebody has a good point. Maybe they're being a total lunatic. It depends on the situation. But that has always been true. So there's many examples in the book of people writing letters to the editor complaining about things like the immorality of I Love Lucy, or the immorality I Love Lucy loosely. That
I
feel like
I
it
Love
should
Lucy.
be a parody, pornographic parody, or the Carol Burnett Show, or SNL, or All in the Family. Unfortunately, because of editing and the way the publishing world works and constructing a book, I wasn't able to include as many examples as I wanted because my editor felt it was becoming redundant. He goes, "You don't need 20 letters trashing Carol Burnett in 1971. Just go with one or two." So if anybody reads the book and feels like it's cherry picking, I got thousands of more examples. They put most of them on the internet, of people writing letters to the editor complaining about what today we would consider very innocuous comedy, saying that it was immoral, that it was disgusting, that it was leading to the downfall of America. And then comedians in response saying, "Hey, you can't joke about anything anymore. People are too sensitive these days," so on and so forth. The same arguments, the same attitudes, but before the internet. And in those days, if you wrote a letter to the editor, there was an editor who chose or declined to publish them. Whereas now, with social media, there is no editor. So every quote-unquote letter to the editor is automatically published. So to me, it creates an illusion that there's greater hysteria, that more people are irrational or sensitive than in the past, and that's what we're told. But based on the sampling of letters to the editor and grievances of the past, it seems to be pretty much the same. It's just before it was filtered and now it is not.
And it's like you say, the most innocuous stuff, though. The example you have in the book of I Love Lucy is that they dare to show her be a pregnant woman in the world, as if that's not a thing that it was existing and people interacted with could be on a near daily basis. The idea of seeing a pregnant woman on television was offensive.
Yes.
And I will say those letters, I mean, boy, it could make current Twitter users blush. I mean, people are using the most offensive, horrifying sort of language to get their point across, and they were printed in the newspaper. I mean, it's pretty incredible in terms of just the vitriol that was being spilled, and I think we do as people want to flatten the past, right? You want to just be like, things were different back then. They were better. They were easier. This was normally accepted as reality. And here we are 50 years later and we're living in crazier times. Yeah. And the example, I just love this example so much because it hit so close to home, was the Richard Dawson on Family Feud. Because we'd watch those reruns as a family, and my parents would just go, "Look at him. He's kissing all these women. It's hilarious." And that's just what times were back then, not realizing that there was a letter campaign that he was possibly spreading or herpes orally, and then it led to magnifying glass inspections of contestants, because also they weren't going to say, "Richard, stop kissing these women." They were like, "We're going to have to magnifying glass check every contestant before he kisses you." So no matter what it was, no matter how silly it seems, how long ago it was, there were people at the time going, "This is wrong, right? We shouldn't let this happen," or there's problems here. We like to flatten that stuff out and say, "Oh, it was fine. It just happened. And we were okay with it, and it was no big deal."
Yeah, I mean, a good example of that attitude that you're describing is if you go to YouTube and watch clips of like older comedy and then look at the comments section. So if it's Eddie Murphy or Sam Kinison or Andrew Dice Clay, it'll say things like, "back when nobody complained," or "you wouldn't be able to get away with this today." And I have a section in the book that combines those three, Eddie Murphy, Sam Kinison, and Andrew Dice Clay, because their respective controversies in the 80s were very similar. Now, you could argue that those three probably were the three biggest stand-up comedians of the 1980s. Eddie Murphy was a huge act, incredibly profitable. So was Sam Kinison. So was Dice Clay. They played rock venues, stadiums, won Grammys. All three of them, at the height of their stand-up careers, were subjected to protest campaigns because they used gay slurs. In some instances with Sam Kinison, and Dice Clay, they were protested by feminist groups and whatnot. Eddie Murphy primarily protested by gay groups and AIDS health advocates. And the number of protests that they were subjected to was substantial. It didn't affect their success or their acts any more than a transgendered movement affects Dave Chappelle's success or act. It doesn't affect it really at all. It maybe makes some people more aware of those grievances. But Eddie Murphy was subjected to protests throughout America when he toured because he was using various slurs. And so was Andrew Dice Clay, and so was Sam Kinison. They would play Minnesota, there'd be pickets out front. They'd play Vancouver, there'd be pickets out front. There'd be people saying to the venue, cancel this show. They survived that, you know, it didn't really affect their success. But those protests existed, just as they often exist today. So it was not particularly different. It's just people either chose to ignore it or people are too young to have known about it. Certainly, when you hear in the media you can't joke about anything anymore, nobody points to those examples.
Yeah.
Except for me. Nobody wants to fucking hear it. But so the similarities are striking sometimes. And that kind of hopefully is what makes this book fun. You know, I try not to hit people over the head with it, but of course you're supposed to read this book and go, huh, that reminds me of something that happened last week, or that's like something that somebody would say today. And it is, of course.
Yeah. There was a particular example that I found that I thought was like felt eerily similar was he would to a smaller degree. You mentioned Myron Fagan, who was the failed playwright. He wrote an anti-communist sort of play that was panned by critics.
Yeah.
And then he becomes an incredibly vocal critic and hate mail writer and sort of a pamphlet writer for these sort of organizations that were fighting against Hollywood and their involvement. Specifically, it was Steve Allen involved in trying to, that little old thing of, fighting off nuclear armament, how dare he? But, all these things were thrown around as the common refrain throughout all of that. The last century seems to be communism. It's all, and it continues to this day.
Yeah.
But I found that to be so interesting that this guy who, took his shot at showbiz as a playwright or wanted to continue on and had his personal beliefs, kind of gets bounced from the industry. And, if you were around today, I feel like he might start a podcast and move to Austin, Texas is kind of the sort of parallel I drew there. But
yeah, I mean, I wasn't thinking that parallel myself, but yeah, Myron Fagan was really aggressive, and he was a guy who hated the civil rights movement. And I don't know that his pamphlets used the N-word, but it did use the word mongrel a lot in referring to civil rights advocates. And his pamphlets were stocked by John Birch Society bookstores, which were extreme, maybe slightly extreme than him. But yeah, Myron Fagan is a weird dude. There's a whole FBI file on him that you can read on archive.org that goes into some of his other behaviors. And he lasted for generations. And he was, a podcast is DIY. And in those days, bigots, their sort of DIY style was pamphlets. They would self-publish. And even today, I ordered for research some of those Myron C. Fagan pamphlets, and they showed up. I've got them off Amazon. They were $5 a pop, and they were like reprints. They were brand new. And I looked at the address where they came from, and it said like, I can't remember exactly, but it was something like Thunderbolt Press, Boise, Idaho. And I was like, that doesn't sound good. And I looked it up, and it's like a fucking white supremacist, like militia imprint that's reprinting all the Myron C. Fagan. So I felt guilty that I was ordering them, but I needed them for research, and it's him complaining about Myrna Loy being a commie and Gregory Peck is a commie conspirator and all this stuff. But that DIY sort of underground was real prevalent in those days. Going back to the 30s, there were all these anti-FDR pamphlets and tying him to like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion type conspiracy. The Rothschilds put him in there and that type of stuff. And it's always sort of been underground, but it's certainly gotten more and more mainstream. But even in those days, somebody like Henry Ford, could compare to somebody like Elon Musk, this extremely powerful, wealthy, successful industrialist, but also pushing these crazy like anti-Semitic things, and like there's all kinds of parallels, of course.
Oh, there's so many throughout the book. I mean, one of the things that as I read and because you mentioned obviously there's thousands of examples that you just couldn't fit into this book on. Again, for the basis of it becoming redundant. But I mean, as you research this stuff, did you just I mean, how do you not lose your mind? How do you not go just to see what the narrative is today or what people are saying today?
It's the exact opposite. It almost is calming in a way.
Okay.
Because people feel like the world is ending. There's all these horrible things happening. Right. Of course, there are horrible things happening. But if you had Twitter and an iPhone in 1939 and we're scrolling through it and you're like, oh my God, what's happening in Germany? Oh my God, what's happening in Poland? Look what's happening with Joseph Stalin. Oh my fucking God. Jim Crow, lynching. They want to fucking, like it's just, you would be immobilized and crippled with fear and agony about the state of the world. And some people were. My next door neighbor today is 98 years old, and she moved to Hollywood in 1942. She wasn't born in 42. She moved here in 42.
That's incredible.
And I was asking her, I go, so when you moved, she told me a little bit about her life. She was an actress. And I said, you said that when you moved to town, you worked at the thrifty drugstore on Hollywood Boulevard. She goes, yeah, I hated that job. I go, well, what was Hollywood Boulevard like in 42? And I expected the answer to be, well, it was very glamorous. It was the golden age of Hollywood Boulevard. Now we think of it as sordid and run down and gross. And she goes, oh, it was awful. I go, why was it awful? She goes, well, I was working in the drugstore and all these women with sores all over their legs would come in and with forged prescriptions trying to get opiates. And I go, wait, in 1942? She goes, yes, it was the wartime. Everybody was crazy, which you don't think of as being the case. But because of the state of the world, the Holocaust, people fighting overseas, people's husbands being killed, or being crippled or injured or whatever, or just general world anxiety, a lot of people resorted to drugs. And so she was saying that Hollywood Boulevard was just populated with drug addicts, and it was scary for her to walk home in 1942. So again, the parallels between the past and the present are much closer than people understand. And a lot of what we know about history, or what we think we know about history, is based on the viewing of old TV shows, based on the viewing of old movies. I mean, look how polite people were. Look how well dressed they were. But that's on the MGM Studios backlot. Reality was not portrayed, really.
Yes.
You didn't see, with a couple of minor exceptions, Jim Crow portrayed on the screen. You didn't see lynchings on the screen. Even when you did, in a movie like The Oxbow Incident or Fritz Lang's Fury with Spencer Tracy, they made all the characters white, And I talk in the book about some Rod Serling scripts that he wrote about Emmett Till and other sort of racist incidences, and how the sponsors forced him to change all the characters to white. If it took place in the Deep South, it had to be moved to the North, Reality was purged and sanitized throughout much of show business history. So I think it has, as much as I love old movies and old TV shows, it has distorted our perceptions of what history was like, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think that's what the book does such a good job of is obviously showing that, again, these things were always out there, that people were always out there.
To answer your question, no, it doesn't devastate or cripple me as I look at all these horrible things. It's almost reassuring that the end times are not necessarily nigh, as we are constantly told. And there's quotes in the book from people like Billy James Hargis, who was a far-right Baptist preacher, saying that the communists are going to take control of America by 1972. It's not even a question anymore. The civil rights movement is a communist conspiracy. It's the road to tyranny. You got to be skeptical of people that are consistently invoking the words freedom, liberty, or tyranny, because most often they're tyrants opposed to other people's freedom and liberty.
Yes. and I love that. I mean, just again, you have over and over again these examples of these preachers, these people who kind of raise themselves up to be the arbiters of what is good or bad, and they make these predictions. There was one in particular, I can't remember who exactly had said it, but it was, by allowing this on TV right now, in 8 years we will have pornographic material, hardcore pornography on television by 1980, and you're just like, That's what a specific prediction.
Yes.
8 years. I was like, how did he do it? How would he know in 8 years? And
there used to be a Detroit preacher, passed away now, lived forever, named Jack Van Impe. I don't know if you ever saw him on TV. You might recognize him. He had this white hair. He didn't have a congregation. He sat at a desk, and he had a wife with a real high-pitched voice, and they would do prophecy. They would go through the daily news and say, see, the Bible predicted that this was going to happen, every week they would do this. But he has a great sermon that got sampled, I think by Bob Seger and some other rock musicians, and it was like that. It's from the late 60s, and he said something like, I had it to memory because I used to put it in between songs on mixtapes when I was a kid. But he said something like, 1973 is the year that they're now planning for sex in the streets in every major city from coast to coast. And get ready for a shock. The music that they're planning to use to crumble the morals of America is this rotten, filthy, dirty, lewd, lascivious junk called rock and roll. I preached in my conversion how 40 million women had illegitimate babies. They said not just the lyrics, the beat. The fertility beat of the jungle is wrapped up in this modern rock. So throw away your Herman's Hermits. Throw away your Beatles. As he goes on, but I mean, 1973 apparently was the year that there would be sex in the streets because of Herman's Hermits and other.
Who's going to lead you there but Herman's Hermits? If anybody is going to do it.
Filthy. Yeah. Disgusting. But, that kind of stuff is fun. It's also entertaining. It's a lunacy, but you can't help but ridicule it. So I think a lot of the propaganda today is very effective, and unfortunately it affects a lot of comedians who buy into it. But really, the purpose of the comedian in this climate should be to ridicule that. Yeah. Ridicule the nonsense, ridicule the fire and brimstone, ridicule people who say they have no freedom of speech, ridicule people who say the end times are near, instead of buying into it. But repetition is such a effective propaganda tool. And when think tanks or corporations or whoever, political players, people who have benefited from things like the Citizens United ruling have unlimited money to spend, you can send out propaganda relentlessly on a conveyor belt and never run out of resources to do so. And so inevitably it affects both stupid people and smart people. Anybody can be manipulated by propaganda, especially if you are exposed to it often enough. So, but I really feel like that's the type of shit that people should be ridiculing. I kind of missed the days of Mad Magazine when everything was punctured. I don't see that many comedians making fun of Dave Chappelle, but he's a huge celebrity, a huge star. You would think that everybody would be mocking the most popular person, which is what has traditionally comedy has done. SCTV, when it became popular in the 70s, would make fun of all the icons of comedy. They would mercilessly ridicule people like Bob Hope, even Woody Allen and George Carlin, who were closer in age to the SCTV cast, got really raked over the coals and roasted by them. And Saturday Night Live, when it first started, they would ridicule the old guard of comedians. Like I saw a funny sketch not long ago from the 70s, segment on Weekend Update where Bill Murray interviews Lucille Ball and Gary Morton, and they're played by Gilda Radner and Alan Zweibel, the writer. And Gary Morton, who was Lucille Ball's husband in the 70s, everybody joked that he was just like, the only reason anybody knew who he was because he married Lucille Ball. So in this fake interview, it's Gilda Radner as Lucy, and she's got a voice like this. And I am so happy with Gary now. He's the love of my life. Along with my 2 talentless children, we have a wonderful life. And Gary Morton, played by Alan Zweibel, doesn't say anything. He just smiles and nods through the whole thing. And they were both still alive, and it's sort of this vicious roasting of Lucy and Desi. But when you're that famous, you're a natural target. I just don't see too many comedians today roasting Dave Chappelle or roasting Joe Rogan. I think they want to be on Chappelle's tour. They want to be on Rogan's podcast, and maybe, are too timid to ridicule. The people who ridicule everything else, you can't joke about anything anymore. I'm going to go after these alphabet people. but they never go after somebody as huge and famous and popular as Joe Rogan, or huge and famous and popular as Dave Chappelle, the way that, the early SCTV would have, or the early Mad Magazine would have. And I kind of miss that. This is tangential, but I really enjoy comedy about comedy.
Yeah.
When Gilbert Gottfried would do his impression of elderly Groucho Marx, it's so fucking funny to me.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean he didn't love Groucho, but he saw how ridiculous those old elderly Groucho appearances were, and sycophants like Dick Cavett would never criticize them, but they were like these pedantic, boring, like ponderous interviews.
Endless, silly,
that didn't include this great wit that we had been conditioned to expect.
I think you definitely obviously cover this in the book as well, that there's a point where every comic, it seems to reach this like elder statesman, the Bob Hopes, or people who, again, Bob Hope, who you say in the 30s and 40s was cutting edge for being, sort of even daring to go after politics at all, or, and then by the 90s, he's just, he's so, or even the 80s is so out of touch.
Well, the paradigm shift with Bob Hope happened in the late 60s.
Oh, well, yes. Yeah.
So that new generation of college students equated him with the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
So he was rejected out of hand, the same way that transgendered advocates or allies of that movement might reject Dave Chappelle simply because of this connection to politics or a point of view that is anathema to them, So the late 60s is when Bob Hope suddenly split his audience, 50% in favor, 50% opposed. The young people were opposed. The old people who grew up with him still stood by him.
Yeah.
And the young people gravitated to new, younger voices that reflected their sensibility. So like a George Carlin or a Cheech and Chong or a Lily Tomlin or Richard Pryor or Robert Klein. Young college students gravitated towards those people. And a lot of the things that you hear today, a lot of the hysteria around college campuses and free speech, blah, 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 young people usually gravitate towards comic voices that are also young.
Right.
They can relate to them. They reflect their experience. Jerry Seinfeld is 65 years old. Hard to believe he doesn't look 65 or seem 65, but he's a senior citizen. So if he feels that there's a Paul when he plays a college campus, like a resistance, which he has said, maybe it has to do with that age factor. You're no longer the young hip guy, which is very difficult for any of us to accept as we get old, to realize, we're out of touch, that we don't know the cool places to go.
What the young people are saying, yes, yeah.
Yeah, we don't understand the slang. We never heard of this band. And in the olden days, you knew everything, and now you know nothing. And it's hard to grapple with, and it happens to everybody. But when you're super famous, it's almost tragic to see it happen in real time. No pun intended, Bill Maher.
Yeah. So, you kind of talk about this, again, the propaganda that's being put out, again, that is now being taken in by comics and sort of used. But you kind of get to the origins of that, or at least at what I would, obviously it was happening before, but it seems like there's one particular person who you highlight in the book, Paul Weyrich, who seems to understand and grasp that, who, as you also described, was too radical for Republicans 20 years earlier, eventually becomes to be embraced by them. But he seems to be the guy who goes, let's weaponize the culture war. Let's use that. And then now we're sort of living in the wake of that. And it's at its highest point, it feels like. But so this guy was,
I think his last name is pronounced Weyrich.
Oh, Weyrich. Okay.
Yeah, he sort of was considered, not by left-wingers, but by his contemporaries as the architect of the modern culture war. So George Will, who's a famous conservative columnist and used to be on Nightline, and I think he still is on those Sunday morning political shows. He himself said Paul Weyrich is sort of the architect of the culture war, and they were friends, so he wasn't saying it as a put down. But Paul Weyrich was a lecturer in the 60s with the John Birch Society, and he would go and speak at Republican groups, women's clubs and what have you, and then they would complain afterwards, why did you send this guy? He's like an extremist radical.
Yeah.
Because he's talking about abolishing public education, the civil rights movement's a commie conspiracy, tyranny is on the march, all this stuff. And so he was sort of rejected by Republicans. The John Birch Society in the 60s, as famous as it was widely ridiculed. It was never successful in the mainstream, but it was known in the mainstream because people would always talk about it. So folk groups like the Chad Mitchell Trio had a song making fun of the John Birch Society. Mad Magazine would make fun of the John Birch Society. George Carlin, when he went solo, he had been in the comedy team. One of the first routines he ever did as a solo comic was mockery of the John Birch Society. Bob Dylan had a famous song mocking the John Birch Society. Johnny Carson would crack jokes about them in his opening monologues in the 1960s. So it was sort of a laughingstock, even though it had some traction, and they had a chain of bookstores called American Opinion Libraries, and you could get anti-civil rights literature there. And Charles Koch of the Koch brothers ran one of those bookstores when he was like 18, 19, 20 in Wichita, Kansas. His father, Fred Koch, the father of the Koch brothers, was a co-founder of the John Birch Society with this guy Robert Welch, who was the guy who made Junior Mints. Yeah. So Junior Mints, the manufacturer of Junior Mints, was opposed to Martin Luther King. Paul Weyrich was a lecturer for the John Birch Society, but he was very savvy politically. He was a smart strategist, an evil strategist, but a smart strategist. And he could see that the John Birch Society was a laughingstock. Everybody made fun of it. So he sort of retreated to the shadows. And in 1973, with major financing from the Scaife fortune, SCAIFE, they still exist as the Sarah Scaife Foundation, one of the biggest bankrollers of Donald Trumpism. In 1973, with money from the Scaife family, Richard Scaife then, now Sarah Scaife, I guess it's his daughter, and Coors Beer, Joseph Coors, they gave Paul Weyrich several $1 million, and he founded something called the Heritage Foundation, which still exists to this day, which still has a tremendous influence in right-wing circles. And they basically just took the same philosophy that the John Birch Society had been pushing and rebranded it.
Yeah. Dressed it up a little. Yeah.
They kind of got rid of the most obnoxious conspiracy theory delivery and then presented it as if it were scholarship, saying, according to our studies, according to our senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. You still hear this phrase in news all the time. So-and-so is a senior fellow at the Heritage. What the fuck does that mean? Nobody in the history of watching TV has ever been received an explanation. You see people on Bill Maher's show, like even on Politically Incorrect in the 90s. He's a senior fellow at the Heartland Institute. Mm-hmm. What is a senior fellow? What's the Heartland Institute? No explanation. Yeah, just have to assume this is a reputable person. Yeah. Don't realize that they've been campaigning against the civil rights movement for much of their life.
Right. They're from a think tank funded by the Butterfinger family. And you just go, oh, okay, great, awesome. I guess we have to believe every word they say.
Exactly. So Paul Weyrich sort of designed that. Let's take the most extremist elements, but wrap them up in this veneer of respectability and scholarship, when really it's not scholarship. It's like the conclusion, black people are less intelligent than white people, is there, and then they construct a paper to try and back it up, you know. And Paul Weyrich founded multiple think tanks, generally with the same funding from the same people, that appeared to be independent of each other. So then when they would come up with an argument, and I'm just using a hypothetical but not that far-fetched example that they might purport that black intelligence is less than white intelligence, they would have it presented by multiple different think tanks and sources and say, look, they say it, they say it, they say it, they say it. Nobody pointing out, well, how come they're all funded by the same three people and you're the same person that founded all of them? Mm-hmm. So Paul Weyrich, former John Birch Society member, founds the Heritage Foundation in 1973, founds the Moral Majority with Jerry Falwell in 1979, founded something called the Council for National Policy, which is still around today, and helped bolster Donald Trump in 2016. Helped facilitate Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition in 1989, and helped create something called ALEC, the American Legislative Executive Council, which today ghostwrites legislation that is frequently anti-free speech, anti-protest bills, and they receive funding, again, from the Scaife Foundation, Charles Koch Foundation, and and multiple other foundations. There's about 12 of them. They all work in tandem. And ALEC is on the push to privatize schools, to remove public funding from public schools, transfer it to private schools. That's one of their big campaigns. Basically, they are the architects of the far right. And to not sound conspiratorial, it's not secret. Like, it's all there to learn about and read about. It's just nobody bothers to refer to it. Nobody wants to explain what a senior fellow is, what this foundation is. When there was that controversy between Neil Young and SiriusXM and Joe Rogan, it concerned this doctor that he had interviewed. That this doctor who was saying, this or that about COVID, he was from the Heartland Institute. I don't think it was even mentioned. The Heartland Institute was founded by Philip Morris Cigarettes in 1985, and what they did was recruit reputable medical people, doctors who had a reputation, who had awards and degrees, and lured them in with money, said, we'll pay you $1 million. We want you to go on the radio shows and say there's no link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. That's what the Heartland Institute was founded for. In the 90s, they started to get funding from the oil industry, and they did the same thing with global warming, and would hire skeptics to go into the media, people who already had a reputation, pay them more than they were making wherever they were working, to say the opposite of what they believed. And so now, most recent history, Heartland Institute was doing that with COVID misinformation. But nobody points that out. It's like nobody, say, so-and-so is a senior fellow at the Heartland Institute. Well, what is that? Who funds that? Why was it funded? What does it do? I mean, these are simple questions, easily answered. It's not a conspiracy, but it's very easy to do the equivalent thereof when nobody bothers to even look at the most basic questions.
And you kind of also link, obviously, the rise of that sort of the culture war thing, the link of Wayrick as he sort of rises and creates all these things with, again, back to showbiz and Ronald Reagan becoming president in the 80s and that kind of culture that he fosters, and again, and how he sort of supported these things, and it led to people who were in his wake as Ed Asner as the head of SAG, and his show being canceled because he's supporting anti Reagan policy abroad. Yeah.
I mean, I don't even know if that part is totally true. Like, I tell the story in the book by giving both points of view, where people feel that Ed Asner, his TV show Lou Grant, was canceled because of his personal politics. There are other arguments that say, well, no, it just sort of coincided with the sinking of the ratings. And there's another argument that the whole reason the ratings were sinking is because there was a campaign against him.
Yeah.
So I don't really have a distinguished conclusion to make. I present both sides of that argument. Oddly, I actually pay Ronald Reagan a compliment in the book. I say that his detractors always insulted him by calling him a failed actor or a bad actor. And I disagree. I think he was a very successful actor. He was under contract for years to Warner Brothers during the height of the studio system, and he appeared in some great fucking movies. It wasn't all just him and a monkey. He also did Juke Girl, which is a great movie that people should watch. It's just a really good movie. He did not deserve the hate for his film career, but it was so much more simple to put down Ronald Reagan for his film career rather than to go through the details of the policies, which were the thing you should be criticizing. It's like when people criticize Donald Trump. What do they criticize? His spray tan? His hair? Like, it's the most superficial criticism. You can criticize the important things. It's just easier to say, oh, Ronald Reagan was a bad actor, a failed actor, bedtime for Bonzo. It's like, no, there's more important things to you. That's like the good thing about him.
Right, it's that
he did a movie
positive thing. Yeah.
He did a movie with a monkey. Who doesn't love that? But yeah, there was that correlation because the Heritage Foundation, they first kind of landed on the map in 1974, the year after they were founded, in a famous textbook censorship case in Kanawha County, largely driven by the Ku Klux Klan locally, who were trying to suppress books that spoke positively of the civil rights movement, that mentioned James Baldwin. They were trying to censor black history, essentially. And
Not hard to draw a parallel there to modern times.
Yeah, no, it was exactly the same. And Heritage Foundation provided lawyers free of charge to defend these protesters that were protesting textbooks. And then in 1980, when Reagan got elected, they provided him with what they called the Mandate for Leadership, which was written by the Heritage Foundation and all their former Birchers of policies they wanted Reagan to implement. And this is sort of like ALEC today. They make it easy for a legislature to just read this ghost-written legislation rather than have to write it themselves and just rubber stamp it. It's written by lobbyists who funded their political campaign anyways. They got elected. Now they pay it forward, pay it back by implementing this ghost-written legislation. And they kind of got annoyed with Reagan because he did not implement everything they wanted. They wanted to, eliminate Social Security, and he didn't do it, and it really annoyed them. And so some of the funders started to put more money into other think tanks to sort of expand this sort of influence, so they wouldn't have to be reliant just on one politician alone. But anyways, it sounds boring when I talk about it, but I tried to make it entertaining in the book itself.
Absolutely, and you include enough showbiz and great stuff. I mean,
the book is about show business. The culture wars are inherently political.
Yes, yeah, they intersect is the reality.
Also, I'm not American, so I actually don't give a fuck as much.
Yeah, you're Canadian. This isn't your politics, you know.
I don't really care. I mean, I do care, but it's not up to me to solve. I can't solve it. Even if I were involved in a protest movement. If I got arrested in a mass arrest, you see sit-in protesters in like a congressman's office or something like that. That's all and fine. Somebody's American, they get arrested, they get charged, they get released. That doesn't happen with me. If I get arrested, I get deported. I get my working papers revoked. I'm not allowed to ever come back. So I got a little more to lose. So I prefer to just write, provide people with the knowledge and information, and then they can go do the actual political actions.
Sometimes we require an outsider's perspective on these things, I think.
The best movies about Los Angeles are all like foreign filmmakers.
Exactly. Chinatown by Roman Polanski, of course.
Zabriskie Point, and there's a movie called The Outside Man that's a French film from 1972. And for some reason, people from outside of America frequently have the best perspective about America.
Yeah, they can understand what's so ridiculous about what it is we're doing here.
Well, sometimes the ridiculous stuff is obvious.
Right. Yes,
everybody else in the world has healthcare, and they're not upset about it. And even in Canada, right-wingers support universal healthcare. They would never, ever run a political campaign with the pledge to repeal it. They would get 0 votes. So.
Include one Reagan story that I, just even an anecdote of... he would clean his contact lenses by sucking on them after dinner.
Okay, my publisher didn't want us to put this in there because he goes, "What the fuck does that have to do with anything in the book?" And I go, "Nothing, but it's such a weird, funny story." It was not in a political book. It was in a book by a woman named Sheila Graham. Sheila Graham was a Hollywood gossip columnist like Hedda Hopper or Luella Parsons. And she wrote a book called Hollywood Confessions, and it's just about her career and all the movie stars she knew, and talks about Errol Flynn and Shirley Temple. And she talks about Ronald Reagan, and she says, when I first met Ronnie, he was dating Nancy, and they were at Sardi's, and in the middle of the meal, Ronnie took his contact lenses out, put them in his mouth, sucked on them, and then put them back in his eyes. And I thought that was so funny. It was just such a ridiculous, stupid, has nothing to do with anything. So when I was writing this little section about Ronald Reagan, I have notes on my computer. If I read a book and there's some weird anecdote about show business, I just transcribe it, source it, and maybe one day it'll find a place into my work somewhere. And so I did a search on my file for like Ronald Reagan when I was doing that section. I was like, oh yeah, that anecdote. So I put it in there. And then I get this note from my editor like a few months ago. It's all red circled around there. He goes, "This is weird, but why? Question mark, question mark, question mark. Like, why do we need it?" And I go, "Well, I'd like to keep it." And he goes, "Okay." And it has nothing to do with furthering the story. Every anecdote should further the theme of the book. But that one is just totally on its own, but I don't know, it's just funny to me.
It's too weird not to put in on, and you can tell him I loved it. I will hold on to it forever now because it's what a great story.
Apolitical. Like it really has nothing to do with politics. I guess you could construe it as being anti-Reagan in a way, but I think the way Sheila Graham told it wasn't supposed to be political, and I did intentionally put it directly below the compliment of saying that he made some pretty good movies. You got to see Juke Girl starring Ronald Reagan. Great movie.
Putting it on the list. Okay, that sounds good. You can kind of see how cyclical this whole the nature of all this is, and is there anything? What can we learn from that it's cyclical? Just that we need to. How can we break this cycle? Is there any way from? I mean, and not to say you have to solve this problem, but do you have any thoughts on that? Is it just returning to satirizing the people on the top, or finding a way to get corporate money out of politics?
The best way would be to purchase a new book called Outrageous, Showbiz and the Culture Wars by Kliph Nesteroff. You can get it at SKYLIT Books in person. You can order it online. You can come to one of the events live that SKYLIT will be sponsoring at Dynasty Typewriter Theater on December 4th. That is definitely the best way to combat all this, is to get the book. It's very, very difficult because how do we combat it? I don't know, but all I can do to combat it is provide knowledge and evidence that people could then use to try and combat ignorance to the best of their ability.
Well, and I'll just to kind of wrap up. I think you end on such an interesting note, the book, where you get into the controversy that surrounds the Dixie Chicks, now known as the Chicks, because of their willingness to go against the Iraq War and criticize President Bush, and they're immediately sort of shouted down, and the internet is mobilized against them. Which just like as you leave the book, it's like almost feels ominous knowing the next 20 years and the role that the internet begins to play. And you know, what was your decision to end there and just sort of leave it off for people to know? And this is where the internet takes it, basically.
I really don't like to write about modern times. I just am not that good at it. You know, I frequently get asked to write about modern comedy, but there's other people that do that. It's really not my specialty. And it's hard to have perspective about anything when you're living in it, for whatever reason. Perspective is all about looking at the past. So ending on the Dixie Chicks, there's a quote from their manager saying, you know, the scary thing is, and this is before Facebook, he's talking about AOL Online. Yeah. I think those free discs that used to get that said 40 free hours of internet, and you'd see like 100 of them in the fucking gutter of an alley discarded. He was saying that, you know, the scary thing about the internet is that now people can gain traction in some sort of hysteria and mobilize against, you know, people in real life. You know, I'm paraphrasing completely, but so yeah, it is supposed to leave you with the thought of that is like now, look at what's happened now. I don't like writing about the present. I find it sort of boring to do so. Mm-hmm. I definitely don't like writing about the internet. It feels like writing about writing, you know, just not interesting. And also, we all know what's happening now. We all know what the last 10 years looked like. But there are grown adults who were not cognizant in 2003. You know, there are people that are about to turn 20 years old that were born at that time. So I want to provide information about things that people don't know rather than focus on things we already know. And that is sort of is the crux of this book, is finding all the anecdotes that you'll find interesting, that you'll find funny, that you'll find entertaining, that you'll find analogous, but that you didn't know. And all three of my books, is that really is the purpose, is to elevate things that are true but completely uncommon knowledge.
And I think this book only furthers to succeed at that. And I would say it's enlightening, it's fascinating. You find these anecdotes, and also you are yourself a very, very funny writer, and I appreciate that as well.
Yeah,
it makes the medicine go down a little easier.
Terribly unfunny during the podcast. We were funnier before we started recording. But
hilarious, unbelievable, cutting it up.
There are blurbs on the back cover. Steve Martin and Bob Odenkirk both say that the book is funny. So please, if you're skeptical of picking up a book that sounds super heavy and depressing, it's not. It's mostly people talking about how Carol Burnett is the immoral downfall of America. So please get the book. You'll enjoy it. It's fun. It's entertaining. It's not depressing. And you can learn about Ronald Reagan sucking on his contact lenses in the middle of dinner and then putting them back in his eyes.
100%. And that it is comforting to know that this has been happening and it continues to happen. And again, the world has not ended, that we have not spun off our axis. Culture has not come to an end as we know it. Things that we will move forward. There will always be comedy. There will always be funny people. And I think there's comfort to be gained there.
There will always be comedy. The world has always been shit.
Yeah.
And you got to find the sunshine in the shit. Is that a metaphor?
Good. I like that. Yeah, that's
the sunshine in the shit. I think it's a John Denver song.
Yeah. So I think now that we've reached this point, I'll say again, come to SKYLIT Books. It's going to be in our Arts Annex, 1814 North Vermont. Come buy the book. It's coming out November 28th. Come pick it up right the day that it opens.
Pre-Christmas sales, man.
Buy it for your uncles, your dads, all the people who think that they just can't say anything anymore. Let them know that that's not true, that it's never been true. And join us next time. Thanks so much for being here, Kliph. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the SKYLIT Books podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode, or others, please visit skylitbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.